Ladies and gentlemen, the lawyer's voice echoed in the silent courtroom. Allow me to introduce Exhibit A. Proof that the billionaire sitting before you has not only wronged my client, but has also hidden a truth so shocking it changes everything. Gasps filled the room as the lawyer lifted a sealed folder. The teenage girl sitting beside him, dressed in a modest blue blouse and jeans, stared straight ahead, her lips trembling but her eyes steady. The billionaire store owner, an older man with a salt and pepper beard, leaned back in his chair, his face expressionless but his knuckles white from clutching the armrest. The lawyer opened the folder, pulling out a photograph and a sheet of paper. This, Your Honor, is proof that Mr. Patrick Reese, the respected owner of Reese's Megamart empire, is not only guilty of wage theft but also— The lawyer paused, scanning the room as tension climbed like a rising tide. He's the biological father of my client, Miss Sarah Miller. A stunned silence hung over the room for a moment before chaos erupted. Reporters' pens scratched furiously, and murmurs spread like wildfire. Patrick Reese shot to his feet, his voice booming. "That's a lie! I don't even know her!" Sarah's eyes glistened with tears, but she remained still. Her lawyer pressed on, unfazed. "We'll let the DNA test decide that, Mr. Reese. For now, let the court hear the full story of how this teenage cashier was forced to sue her employer, only to uncover a truth she never saw coming." 2 months earlier, 17-year-old Sarah Miller pushed through the heavy glass doors of Reese's Megamart. The air smelled like freshly baked bread and cleaning supplies, a mix she had grown used to. She adjusted her name tag and clocked in, preparing for another long evening behind the register. It wasn't glamorous, but the job helped her save for college, a dream that felt far away but kept her motivated. It had been a typical day. Shoppers streamed in, bags piled up, and Sarah's fingers worked the register like a pro. By 6 p.m., the buzz in the store had quieted, giving her a moment to breathe. That was when her manager, Kevin, approached with a clipboard. "Sarah," he began, avoiding her eyes, "we need to talk about your hours." Her stomach tightened. "What about them?" Kevin scratched his neck nervously. "Corporate says we've been giving part-time employees too many hours. Starting next week, you'll be cut back to 15 hours a week." "Sorry, kid. 15 hours?" Sarah felt her throat tighten. That wouldn't even cover her phone bill, let alone her savings for school. "But that's not fair. I've been working hard, and I need those hours." Kevin shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "It's above my pay grade. If you have complaints, take them up with Mr. Reese." The name sent a chill through her. Patrick Reese wasn't just the owner of the store. He was a legend in town. The man everyone admired for building an empire from scratch. But he was also distant, aloof, and almost impossible to reach. Complaints rarely made it past middle management, and Sarah knew it. Still, the unfairness of it burned inside her. Over the next week, she worked her reduced hours, all the while plotting how she might get Mr. Reese's attention. Finally, she had an idea. The following Friday, as Mr. Reese made his monthly visit to inspect the store, Sarah decided to confront him directly. She waited near the employee break room, rehearsing her words. When she saw him walking down the aisle with his entourage, she stepped into his path. "Excuse me, Mr. Reese," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. He stopped, looking surprised. "Yes? And you are?" "Sarah Miller. I work here. Or at least I did until my hours were slashed without explanation." His entourage shifted uncomfortably, but Mr. Reese raised an eyebrow. "If you have a grievance, take it to your manager." "I tried," Sarah said firmly. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us working here. We deserve fair treatment." For a moment, it looked like he might listen, but then his expression hardened. "Young lady, you're welcome to quit if you don't like the rules. Now, if you'll excuse me." Before she could respond, he brushed past her, leaving her stunned and humiliated. But that moment planted a seed of defiance in her. If he wouldn't listen, she'd make him listen another way. Sarah began gathering evidence. She talked to other employees, collected pay stubs, and noted discrepancies. What she uncovered was alarming. Unauthorized wage deductions, unpaid overtime, and deliberate hour cuts designed to avoid offering benefits. With a growing file of evidence, she sought legal help. That's when she met David Carter, a local attorney with a reputation for taking on powerful corporations. He agreed to represent her, warning her it would be a tough battle. But neither of them anticipated the twist that would come next. As the case gained media attention, someone sent Sarah an anonymous tip, a cryptic note with an old photograph attached. The photo showed a younger Patrick Reese standing beside a woman who looked eerily familiar. Scribbled on the back were the words, "Ask him about Lila." Sarah showed the photo to David, who dug into Reese's past. They discovered that Lila had been a cashier at one of Reese's first stores. A few years after Sarah's birth, Lila had died in a car accident, leaving no record of Sarah's father. But the dates, the photo, and other clues pointed to a shocking possibility. Patrick Reese might be Sarah's biological father. When Sarah's lawyer approached Reese's legal team with the claim, they dismissed it as absurd. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She filed a paternity suit alongside the wage theft case, forcing Reese to respond in court. The courtroom buzzed as the lawyer continued, presenting evidence piece by piece. Patrick Reese's face darkened, but he remained silent, his gaze locked on Sarah. The judge called for a short recess, giving everyone time to process the bombshell revelation. As Sarah stepped outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed her, firing off questions. She felt overwhelmed but determined. If this was what it took to stand up for herself and uncover the truth, she was ready for the fight. Inside, Patrick Reese sat alone, his head in his hands. For the first time, the man who seemed untouchable looked vulnerable. But was it guilt, or just fear of losing everything? The recess ended, and everyone returned to their seats. The judge banged her gavel. "Mr. Reese, are you prepared to respond to these allegations?" Reese stood, his voice steady, but his eyes cold. "Your Honor, I have nothing to hide. But these claims are outrageous, and I intend to prove it." The tension in the room was electric. Sarah's heart pounded as she braced for what would come next. But nothing could have prepared her for the bombshell Reese's lawyer dropped moments later. "Your Honor," Reese's attorney announced, "we have evidence that Miss Miller's claims are not only false but part of a deliberate scheme to extort money from my client." The courtroom erupted again, leaving Sarah stunned. Her case was just beginning, but it seemed the battle ahead would be fiercer than she ever imagined. The room buzzed with murmurs after Patrick Reese's lawyer's shocking claim. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, her mind racing. Extortion? The accusation felt like a slap in the face. She turned to David, her lawyer, who whispered calmly, "Stay focused." The judge's gavel brought order back to the courtroom. "Enough! Counsel for the defendant, if you have evidence to support these allegations, you may present it." Reese's lawyer, a polished man with silver-rimmed glasses, stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have emails that suggest Miss Miller's legal team solicited bribes from my client in exchange for dropping this case. These emails call into question the legitimacy of this entire lawsuit." A hush fell over the room. Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but this kind of attack could destroy her case. David stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to discredit my client. We demand to see these so-called emails." The judge nodded. "Provide the evidence for review." The lawyer handed a folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. As the judge scanned the pages, her expression remained neutral. Finally, she looked up. "Mr. Carter, these emails appear legitimate. What is your response?" David strode to the bench to review the documents. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears as she waited. After a moment, David smirked and turned to the courtroom. "These emails are doctored, Your Honor," he announced confidently. "My client never sent these messages. We demand an independent forensic analysis to confirm they're fake." Reese's lawyer objected, but the judge nodded. "I'll allow it. In the meantime, we'll proceed with the other aspects of the case. Miss Miller's legal team, you may continue." David returned to their table, whispering, "That was a scare tactic. Don't let it shake you." Sarah nodded, but the knot in her stomach wouldn't loosen. The courtroom felt heavier now, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on her. But she refused to back down. As the trial continued, the courtroom drama began to spill into Sarah's everyday life. The media latched onto the story of a teenage cashier taking on a billionaire, and her small town became a hotspot for reporters. Cameras waited outside her school, and strangers stopped her on the street with questions. Some were supportive, but others accused her of being a liar or a gold digger. At home, her mom, Mrs. Claire Miller, tried to shield her from the chaos. "Turn off the news," she'd say, setting a plate of cookies in front of Sarah. "Let them talk. You know your truth." But one night, as Sarah flipped through a news report, she noticed something that made her heart sink. The headline read, "Teen Cashier's Case Hits a Snag as Questions About Her Integrity Surface." The report claimed that Reese's legal team had uncovered more evidence suggesting Sarah's case was a money grab. They showed edited photos of her holding stacks of cash, claiming she had accepted bribes from another disgruntled ex-employee to target Reese. "Mom," Sarah shouted, showing her the TV. "This is insane. They're making things up." Her mom sighed, sitting beside her. "Sarah, this is what they do when they're desperate. They'll smear you to protect themselves." Sarah nodded, but the anger simmered. She wasn't going to let them ruin her life without a fight. Back in court, David presented compelling evidence of wage theft. Payroll records showed consistent discrepancies, and former employees testified about similar experiences. Reese's legal team scrambled to counter the claims, but the cracks in their defense were starting to show. Then came a quieter but equally important moment. David approached Sarah with a folder containing new findings about Lila, the woman in the photograph that had sparked the paternity claim. "Sarah," he said gently, "I need to prepare you for this. It might be hard to hear." Sarah opened the folder, her hands trembling. Inside were more photos of Lila with Patrick Reese. They were smiling, standing close, too close to be just co-workers. There were also letters, handwritten by Lila, detailing their relationship. Sarah's voice shook. "She loved him." David nodded. "It seems that way. But the most important part is here." He pointed to a letter dated a month before Sarah's birth. It read, "Patrick, I need you to take responsibility. I can't do this alone." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. Her mother had never talked about her father, and now, years later, she was uncovering a truth that felt both surreal and heartbreaking. "What do we do with this?" she asked. "We present it in court," David replied. "It's powerful evidence, but it also opens the door for their team to attack you harder. Are you ready for that?" Sarah wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready." As the trial progressed, Reese's public image began to crumble. Protests formed outside his stores, with employees demanding fair treatment. Social media lit up with hashtags like #StandWithSarah and #ReeseScandal. The billionaire who had once been untouchable now faced scrutiny at every turn. But Reese wasn't going down without a fight. His lawyers launched a counterattack, subpoenaing Sarah's school records and personal emails, hoping to find anything to discredit her. When that failed, they doubled down on the extortion claims, pushing the narrative that Sarah was nothing more than a greedy teenager. The tension reached a boiling point during a cross-examination. Reese's lawyer grilled Sarah on the stand, asking invasive questions about her finances, her motivations, and even her late mother. "Miss Miller," the lawyer sneered, "isn't it true that you filed this lawsuit for attention? After all, you've been all over the news, basking in the spotlight." "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I filed this lawsuit because I deserve justice." The lawyer smirked. "Justice? Or money? Isn't it true that you've been struggling financially and saw this as an easy way out?" Sarah's hands clenched the edges of the witness stand. "I've been struggling because your client refuses to pay his workers fairly. That's why I'm here." The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but the judge interjected. "Enough. Move on." As Sarah stepped down from the stand, she felt a flicker of hope. She had stood her ground, but the battle was far from over. Later that evening, Sarah and David reviewed their strategy for the next day. The DNA test results were due to be presented, and they could change everything. If the results confirmed Patrick Reese was her father, it would add immense weight to her case. But if not, it could weaken her credibility. "Are you nervous?" David asked. Sarah hesitated. "A little, but mostly I just want the truth." The next morning, the courtroom was packed as the results were handed to the judge. Sarah's heart pounded as the envelope was opened. The judge glanced at the contents, her expression unreadable. The DNA test results are, she paused, looking directly at Patrick Reese. Conclusive. Mr. Reese, you are the biological father of Sarah Miller. The room erupted. Patrick Reese's face turned pale, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had always wondered about her father, but now that she knew, the truth felt heavier than she expected. Reese's lawyer jumped to his feet. Your Honor, we move to strike this evidence as irrelevant to the wage theft case. David countered. It's entirely relevant. It speaks to Mr. Reese's character and his pattern of neglecting responsibilities. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. The revelation had shifted the tide of the case. Patrick Reese wasn't just a billionaire under fire. He was a father who had abandoned his daughter. But before Sarah could process it all, Reese's team dropped another bombshell. Your Honor, Reese's lawyer announced, we intend to call a surprise witness to the stand tomorrow. Someone who will reveal the true motives behind this lawsuit. David froze, his face darkening. Sarah's pulse quickened. Who could they possibly bring in? What could they say? The judge nodded. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. Court is adjourned. As Sarah left the courtroom, her mind swirled with questions. The stakes were getting higher, and the fight was far from over. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just a battle for justice anymore. It was a battle for the truth. The tension was unbearable as Sarah sat across from David in his office that evening. The surprise witness Reese's team planned to bring left them scrambling for answers. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Was it someone from her past? Another employee? She gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles white. I don't like this, David said, pacing the room. They're clearly trying to throw us off balance. But we can't prepare for what we don't know. Sarah sighed. What if it's someone who'll lie about me? What if they twist the story? David stopped pacing and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. If they're playing dirty, we'll expose them. The truth is on our side, Sarah. Don't forget that. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Reporters crowded the back, their cameras clicking as Sarah entered with David. She avoided their stares, focusing on the task ahead. Patrick Reese sat across the room, his jaw tight. For the first time, he looked less composed, like a man losing control of the narrative. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. We will now proceed with the defense's witness, she announced. Mr. Reese, call your witness. Reese's lawyer stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, we call Claire Miller to the stand. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Mom? Her mother entered the courtroom, looking visibly uncomfortable. She avoided Sarah's eyes as she made her way to the witness stand. Sarah's chest tightened. Why was her mom here? What could she possibly say? David leaned towards Sarah, whispering, We didn't see this coming. Stay calm. Mrs. Miller, Reese's lawyer began. Can you confirm your relationship to Sarah Miller's? Claire nodded. She's my daughter. And can you tell us about her motivations for filing this lawsuit? Claire hesitated, glancing briefly at Sarah before looking down at her hands. Sarah wants what's right. She believes she was wronged. Reese's lawyer smiled faintly. But isn't it true that you, as her mother, encouraged her to file this lawsuit? That you saw it as an opportunity to solve your family's financial troubles? Claire's head snapped up. That's not true. Really? The lawyer walked toward the stand, holding a document. Because we have here an email you sent to a friend, stating that Sarah's case could set her up for life. Care to explain that? Claire's face paled. I didn't mean it like that. I was venting. Raising Sarah alone has been hard, and I thought. The lawyer cut her off. So you admit that you saw this lawsuit as a potential financial windfall? No, that's not what I meant. Claire's voice trembled, but the damage was done. Reese's lawyer turned to the jury, a smug expression on his face. David quickly stood. Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant and purely designed to discredit my client. We request that it be stricken from the record. The judge nodded. Sustained. Counsel, stay on topic. Reese's lawyer backed off, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Sarah stared at her mother, betrayal and confusion swirling inside her. When Claire stepped down, she avoided Sarah's gaze, quickly exiting the courtroom. Later that evening, Sarah confronted her mother at home. "Mom, what was that? Why didn't you tell me they called you as a witness?" Claire looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped. "I didn't know until yesterday, Sarah. They showed up at the house and told me I'd be subpoenaed if I didn't cooperate. So you just went along with it?" Sarah's voice cracked with frustration. Claire sighed. "I thought I could help. I didn't know they'd twist my words like that." Sarah shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You made it sound like I'm doing this for money. Do you know how hard I've fought to be taken seriously?" "I'm sorry," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to protect you." Sarah turned away, her heart heavy. She knew her mom meant well, but the damage was done. The defense had successfully sown doubt about her intentions, and it felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling. The trial continued the next day, with David working hard to regain control of the narrative. He presented new testimony from former employees who detailed widespread wage theft at Reese's stores. Their stories mirrored Sarah's, painting a damning picture of the company's practices. One witness, a single mother named Maria, recounted how she had been forced to work unpaid overtime to keep her job. "They told me if I didn't like it, I could leave," she said, her voice shaking. "But I couldn't leave. I needed to feed my kids." David also introduced evidence of emails between Reese's managers, discussing strategies to cut hours and avoid paying benefits. It was clear that the company's practices weren't just mistakes. They were deliberate. The momentum shifted in Sarah's favor, and the public support for her case grew stronger. Social media buzzed with outrage over the testimonies, and protests outside Reese's megamart grew louder. But just as things seemed to be turning around, the trial took another unexpected turn. During the lunch break, David approached Sarah with a grim expression. "We've just received a new piece of evidence from the defense." "It's a video?" "A video of what?" Sarah asked, her stomach sinking. David hesitated. "Of you. From a few weeks before this lawsuit was filed." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What kind of video?" David glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "It shows you arguing with Kevin, your manager, in the break room. They're claiming it proves you were trying to provoke him into firing you so you could sue the company." Sarah's heart pounded. "That's ridiculous. I only confronted him about my hours being cut." David nodded. "I believe you. But if the video is edited or taken out of context, it could hurt us." When the court reconvened, the defense wasted no time presenting the video. It showed Sarah and Kevin in the break room, their voices raised. The footage was grainy, but the audio was clear enough to hear snippets of their conversation. "You can't just cut my hours like that," Sarah's voice echoed in the courtroom. "I have rights, and you know it." Kevin's voice replied, calm but firm. "Sarah, this isn't personal. It's a corporate decision. But it's not fair," Sarah shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "Maybe I should take this to a lawyer." The video ended, and Reese's lawyer turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the behavior of someone seeking fairness. This is someone who planned to create a lawsuit from the start." David quickly objected, arguing that the video was incomplete and taken out of context. The judge allowed him to cross-examine Kevin, who admitted under pressure that the video had been selectively edited by corporate. While David managed to discredit the video's authenticity, the damage lingered. The defense had planted yet another seed of doubt, and Sarah could feel the tide of the trial shifting again. That evening, as Sarah sat alone in her room, scrolling through the latest news coverage, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message read, "They're hiding more than you know. Meet me tomorrow. Alone. 6 p.m. at Pinewood Cafe." Sarah stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Who was this? And what did they know? She hesitated for a moment before typing back. "Who are you?" The reply came almost instantly. "Someone who knows the truth about Patrick Reese." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing. This could be the break she needed, or it could be a trap. Either way, she had to find out. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind spinning with a cryptic message. Who was the sender? Could they be trusted? By morning, the uncertainty weighed heavy, but her curiosity burned brighter. She decided she had to go, no matter the risks. At lunch, she confided in David. "I got a message last night from someone claiming to know more about Reese." David frowned. "Did they say who they were?" "No," Sarah replied. Just that I should meet them at Pinewood Cafe. They said they know the truth. David leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. This could be dangerous, Sarah. It might be a trap set by Reese's team to rattle you. Or worse. I've thought about that, Sarah admitted. But what if they really do know something? What if this could help us? David sighed, rubbing his temples. If you're determined to go, I can't stop you. But you're not going alone. I'll wait nearby. Relieved, Sarah nodded. Thanks. That evening, Sarah arrived at Pinewood Cafe, her heart pounding as she scanned the small, cozy space. A handful of people sat at tables, sipping coffee and chatting. At the back corner, a figure in a black hoodie raised a hand to signal her over. Sarah hesitated, then walked toward the table. The figure lowered their hood, revealing a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a nervous demeanor. "You're Sarah Miller?" the woman asked in a hushed voice. "Yes," Sarah said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Who are you?" The woman glanced around, lowering her voice further. "My name's Rachel Turner. I used to work for Patrick Reese. I was his executive assistant, until I got fired for asking too many questions." "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked. Rachel leaned in, her voice trembling. "Questions about money. Missing money. Reese has been running a scheme for years, skimming from his stores, hiding funds in offshore accounts. But that's not the worst of it." Sarah's stomach dropped. What could be worse? Rachel hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue. Finally, she pulled a flash drive from her pocket and slid it across the table. "This is everything I could gather before they shut me out. Emails, bank transfers, private messages. It proves he's been exploiting employees and hiding illegal profits. And it also has something else." "What?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel took a deep breath. "It has proof that Reese knew about your mother. He paid her to keep quiet about you. She took the money, Sarah." "I'm sorry." Sarah's chest tightened as the words hit her like a punch. "That's not true. My mom would never." Rachel raised a hand. "I don't think she had a choice. Lila was drowning in debt, and Reese used it against her. But the records on that drive are undeniable." Before Sarah could process it, Rachel stood abruptly. "Be careful, Sarah. Reese won't go down without a fight. And if he finds out I gave you this," her voice trailed off, fear flashing in her eyes. "Wait," Sarah called out, but Rachel was already heading for the door. Moments later, she was gone, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. Back at David's office, they plugged the flash drive into his computer. As files opened on the screen, Sarah's pulse quickened. There were spreadsheets showing large sums of money transferred to offshore accounts, accompanied by emails confirming wage theft schemes. But the most damning piece was a scanned contract signed by Patrick Reese and Lila Miller, Sarah's mother. "This is it," David said, his voice grim. "This proves not only that Reese is guilty of the financial crimes, but that he knew about you all along." Sarah stared at the screen, her emotions a mix of anger, betrayal, and sadness. "He bribed my mom to keep quiet, and she took it." David placed a hand on her shoulder. "This doesn't change what we're fighting for. If anything, it strengthens your case." Sarah nodded, but the betrayal stung deeply. Her mother had always avoided talking about her father, and now Sarah understood why. The truth had been bought and buried. The next day in court, David introduced some of the evidence from the flash drive. He carefully avoided mentioning Rachel, presenting the data as anonymous whistleblower material to protect her identity. The revelations hit hard. Emails between Reese and his executives outlined a deliberate plan to underpay employees and avoid legal scrutiny. The jury's expressions shifted as the scope of Reese's greed became clear. But Reese's lawyer was quick to retaliate. During cross-examination, he attempted to discredit the evidence. "How do we know this information wasn't fabricated by your client?" he asked Sarah. David objected, and the judge sustained it, but the question lingered in the air. The defense was grasping at straws, but their tactics kept the courtroom on edge. That night, Sarah returned home to find her mother waiting for her in the kitchen. Claire's face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "I saw the news," Claire began softly. "About the evidence. And about me." Sarah set her bag down, exhaustion mixing with frustration. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" You knew about him. You knew he was my father. Claire's voice broke. I wanted to protect you, Sarah. When Lila died, Reese promised he'd help us, but only if I stayed quiet. I didn't want you to grow up knowing he had abandoned you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You let him get away with it. And now I'm the one fighting to make this right. Claire reached for her hand. I'm sorry. I was scared. I didn't think I had a choice. Sarah pulled away, the pain too fresh. You always have a choice. And you chose him over me. Before Claire could respond, there was a knock at the door. Sarah frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 10 p.m. Who could that be? Claire asked nervously. Sarah opened the door to find two police officers standing on the porch. Her heart sank. Miss Miller, one of them said, we need you to come with us. Sarah's mind raced. What? Why? The officer's face was serious. You're under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud. We have a warrant to search the premises. Shock and confusion washed over Sarah as the officers entered her home. Claire clutched her chest, her voice trembling. This is a mistake. She hasn't done anything wrong. Sarah's voice faltered. I don't understand. What's going on? The officer looked at her with pity. Someone's claiming you fabricated evidence in your case against Patrick Reese. We have to take you in for questioning. As they escorted her to the police car, Sarah glanced back at her mother, who stood frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Inside the car, Sarah's thoughts raced. She knew Reese was behind this, but she had no idea how far he was willing to go, or how she would fight back. Sarah sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, and every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of the chair, the soft shuffle of papers from the officer sitting across from her. The officer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes but a kind demeanor, placed a folder on the table. Sarah Miller, you're being questioned in connection with allegations of evidence tampering and fraud related to your lawsuit against Patrick Reese. Do you understand the charges? Sarah's voice was firm despite her fear. I didn't do anything wrong. This is a setup. The officer leaned back, studying her. We've received an anonymous tip claiming that the evidence you and your lawyer presented in court, specifically the whistleblower materials, was fabricated. They also provided supposed proof that you paid someone to create it. Sarah's heart raced. That's a lie. My lawyer and I got that evidence from someone who worked for Reese. We didn't fake anything. The officer opened the folder, revealing a series of printed emails and bank transfer screenshots. These show correspondence between you and an alleged third party, arranging payment for creating false documents. Care to explain? Sarah leaned forward, her frustration mounting. Those are fake. Reese is trying to frame me because he knows he's losing in court. The officer's eyes softened slightly, but her tone remained professional. Sarah, if what you're saying is true, we'll investigate it. But you need to be honest with us. Do you have any proof that these allegations are false? Sarah's mind raced. The flash drive. Rachel. But revealing Rachel's identity would put her in danger. I can't say where we got the evidence, Sarah said hesitantly. But it's real. I swear. The officer sighed. For now, we're not pressing charges. But we'll need to seize your electronic devices and any materials related to the case for further investigation. You're free to go, but stay reachable. When Sarah walked out of the station, she spotted David waiting outside. His expression was a mix of relief and worry. Are you okay? They think I faked the evidence, Sarah said, her voice trembling. They took my phone and laptop. David frowned. This is Reese's doing. He's desperate and throwing everything at you. But we'll prove the evidence is legitimate. As they drove back to his office, David outlined a plan. We'll get an independent forensic analysis of the flash drive. If it holds up, we can use it to discredit their claims. In the meantime, we'll need to tread carefully. Reese is clearly willing to go to extreme lengths to protect himself. The next morning, Sarah returned to court, feeling the weight of the previous night's events. Reporters swarmed her as she entered, shouting questions about the allegations against her. She ignored them, keeping her head down until she reached the courtroom. Inside, Reese sat with his legal team, looking as composed as ever. But there was a faint smirk on his face that made Sarah's blood boil. He knew what he had done, and he was enjoying her discomfort. As proceedings began, David presented a motion to dismiss the fraud allegations against Sarah, arguing that they were baseless and designed to intimidate her. The judge agreed to review the motion, but allowed the trial to proceed in the meantime. David then shifted the focus back to Reese's financial misconduct. He introduced another witness, a former accountant from Reese's company, who testified about suspicious transactions and efforts to hide profits. The testimony painted a damning picture of Reese's business practices. But just as the momentum seemed to be shifting in Sarah's favor, Reese's lawyer dropped another bombshell. "Your Honor," he said, rising from his seat, "we have new evidence that further implicates Miss Miller in fraudulent activity." David objected immediately. "Your Honor, this is a clear attempt to derail the trial with baseless accusations. The defense is grasping at straws." The judge frowned. "Mr. Henderson, if you have evidence, present it now." Reese's lawyer handed a folder to the judge, who reviewed it silently. After a moment, she looked up, her expression unreadable. "This evidence raises serious concerns. Mr. Carter, I suggest you prepare your client for further questioning tomorrow. Court is adjourned for the day." After court, David and Sarah returned to his office to review the situation. "They're trying to drown us in false allegations," David said, pacing the room. "But we'll fight back." Sarah slumped in her chair, exhaustion weighing on her. "What if it works? What if the jury believes them?" David stopped and looked at her, his voice firm. "They won't. The truth is on our side, and I have a feeling their lies will unravel soon enough." That evening, Sarah received another text from the unknown number. This time it read, "You need to see this. Check the folder under the third shelf at the Pinewood Cafe. It's everything you need to end this once and for all." Her heart raced. She debated telling David, but decided against it. If this lead was real, she needed to act fast. She grabbed her jacket and headed out, determined to find whatever the sender had left for her. The Pinewood Cafe was quiet when Sarah arrived. She scanned the room nervously before heading to the back. Under the third shelf, she found a small envelope taped to the underside. Inside was a USB drive and a note. "Reese's secrets. Be careful who you trust." Before she could leave, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She spun around to see a man in a dark suit and sunglasses. "You shouldn't be here," he said coldly. Sarah's heart pounded. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the envelope in her hand. Sarah turned and ran, her mind screaming with fear. She didn't know who the man was, but she knew one thing. Reese's secrets were worth running for. Back at home, Sarah locked the door and plugged the USB drive into her laptop. The files were explosive, detailed logs of bribes, illegal deals, and even surveillance footage of meetings where Reese discussed covering up his crimes. But what caught her attention most was a file labeled Miller Agreement. She opened it to find a recorded conversation between Reese and her mother. In the audio, Reese's voice was calm but menacing. "You'll keep your mouth shut about Sarah," he said. "Take the money and leave. If you don't, I'll make sure you lose everything." Sarah's hands shook as she listened to her mother's voice, trembling and tearful. "I don't have a choice, do I?" "You don't," Reese replied. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she realized the extent of Reese's manipulation. Her mother hadn't betrayed her willingly. She had been trapped. But before Sarah could process it all, there was a loud knock at the door. Her heart stopped. Peeking through the window, she saw two men in suits standing outside. "Miss Miller," one of them called out. "We need to talk. Open the door." Her pulse raced. She grabbed the USB drive, shoved it into her pocket, and looked for an escape. There was no way she was letting Reese's men get their hands on the evidence. Not when she was so close to exposing the truth. Sarah's heart pounded as the men knocked again, louder this time. "Miss Miller," one of them said firmly, "we just want to talk. Open the door." Her instinct screamed that talking wasn't their real purpose. She clutched the USB drive in her pocket, scanning the room for an exit. The only option was the back window in her bedroom. "Coming," she shouted, trying to buy time. She hurried to her room, slid the window open, and climbed out onto the small patch of grass below. The night air bit at her skin as she crouched behind a bush, holding her breath. From her vantage point, she saw the men grow impatient and force the door open with a loud crash. "Search the place," one ordered. Adrenaline surged through Sarah. She slipped away, keeping low, and darted through her neighbor's yard. Once she was out of sight, she pulled out her phone and called David. "David," she whispered, her voice shaky. "They broke into my house. I don't know who they are, but they're after the evidence." "Where are you?" David asked urgently. "2 blocks away," Sarah said, glancing nervously behind her. "I'm heading to the diner on 8th Street. Stay there." "I'm on my way," he replied. Sarah reached the diner and slid into a booth near the back, her mind racing. The USB drive felt like a weight in her pocket, a mix of hope and danger. Moments later, David arrived, his face pale with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, sitting across from her. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "They tore through my house, David. They were looking for this." She pulled out the USB drive and placed it on the table. David's eyes widened. "What's on it?" "Everything," Sarah said. "Bribes, illegal deals, even a recording of Reese threatening my mom to stay silent about me." David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "This is huge, Sarah, but it's also dangerous. If Reese knows you have this, he'll stop at nothing to destroy it. And you, what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David stared at the drive for a long moment. "We make copies, secure the original, and take it to the court tomorrow. This evidence could blow the case wide open." Later that night, Sarah stayed at David's house, unable to return to her own. As she lay awake on the couch, her mind replayed the events of the day. The recording of her mother haunted her. She could hear the fear in her voice, the helplessness. It made Sarah's resolve burn brighter. Reese had stolen too much from her and her family. It was time to take it all back. But as the hours dragged on, her fear grew. If Reese's men could break into her house, what else were they capable of? The next day in court, David stood confidently as he announced the new evidence to the judge. "Your Honor, we have obtained additional materials that further demonstrate Mr. Reese's misconduct. This evidence includes recordings, financial records, and communications directly implicating him in illegal activities." Reese's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, we have no knowledge of this so-called evidence. We request a delay to review its authenticity." David countered. The defense has had every opportunity to be transparent about their client's actions. This evidence merely corroborates what we've already shown. The judge glanced between the two lawyers before nodding. "The evidence will be admitted. Mr. Henderson, you'll have the opportunity to cross-examine once it's presented." Reese shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his calm demeanor beginning to crack. Sarah watched him closely, a small spark of satisfaction blooming inside her. As the evidence was played in court, the room was gripped by the sheer scale of Reese's corruption. The jury's expressions ranged from shock to disgust as recordings of Reese's threats and admissions echoed through the courtroom. "This is a man who built his fortune on lies," David declared. "He exploited his employees, silenced those who stood against him, and even manipulated the mother of his own child to hide the truth. Patrick Reese is not the pillar of integrity he claims to be. He is a fraud." The jury whispered among themselves as David concluded. Reese's lawyer stood, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, this evidence is circumstantial at best. We contend that it has been manipulated to paint an inaccurate picture of my client." David shot back. "The forensic analysis we've conducted proves otherwise. The data is authentic, and Mr. Reese's own words speak for themselves." The judge called for a recess, allowing both sides to regroup. Sarah stepped outside, feeling a mix of triumph and dread. The evidence was damning, but Reese wasn't beaten yet. She could see it in his eyes as he passed her in the hallway, a cold determination that sent a chill down her spine. During the break, David received a call from a contact in law enforcement. He returned to Sarah, his face grim. "What is it?" she asked, her stomach sinking. "There's been a break-in my office. David said. "The copies of the evidence we made, they're gone." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What? How?" "Security footage shows two masked men breaking in last night," David said. "They knew exactly what they were looking for. But we still have the original, right?" Sarah asked, pulling the USB drive from her pocket. David nodded, his expression tense. "We do. But Reese is clearly escalating. He's desperate, Sarah. We have to be careful." The trial resumed, and David presented his closing arguments, hammering home the evidence against Reese. But as he spoke, Sarah noticed Reese whispering to his lawyer. Something about their exchange unsettled her. The judge announced that closing arguments would continue the next day, and the court adjourned. As Sarah and David left the building, she noticed a black SUV parked nearby. Her pulse quickened as she recognized one of the men who had broken into her house, sitting in the passenger seat. "They're watching us," she whispered to David. He followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "Stay close to me." As they walked to David's car, the SUV pulled out and began following them. Sarah's heart pounded as David made a series of turns, trying to lose their tail. But the SUV stayed close, its intentions clear. Finally, David pulled into a crowded gas station, hoping the public setting would deter their pursuers. The SUV stopped at a distance, its occupants watching but making no move to approach. David turned to Sarah. "We're going to the police right now. If they think they can intimidate us, they're wrong." Sarah nodded, her fear giving way to determination. Reese had gone too far, and she wasn't backing down. But as they drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over, and the next move Reese made might be the most dangerous yet. Sarah and David drove straight to the police station, the black SUV following them most of the way. Only when they pulled into the station's parking lot did the SUV peel off, vanishing into the night. The tension in the car was thick as David escorted Sarah inside, his face grim. The officer at the front desk recognized Sarah immediately. "Miss Miller," he said, his tone cautious. "What brings you here?" David stepped forward. "We need to file a report. Sarah is being followed and harassed by individuals connected to Patrick Reese. They've broken into her home and my office, stolen evidence, and are attempting to intimidate her." The officer nodded, his expression serious. "Do you have any proof?" "We do," David said. "Surveillance footage from my office and Sarah's account of the incidents." The officer sighed. "We'll look into it, but with a case as high profile as this, we'll need solid evidence before we can act." Sarah clenched her fists. "So they can just keep doing this until something happens to me?" The officer softened. "We're not ignoring this, Miss Miller. I'll assign an officer to patrol your neighborhood and another to keep an eye on the courthouse during your trial. But we need more to take direct action against Reese's people." Frustrated but grateful for at least some measure of protection, Sarah and David left the station. The weight of the situation was beginning to crush her, but she knew she couldn't afford to crumble now. The next morning in court, the tension was palpable. The jury looked visibly uneasy, the weight of the case evident in their expressions. David began his closing arguments, weaving the evidence, testimonies, and Sarah's personal story into a compelling narrative. Patrick Reese built his empire on the backs of hardworking people like Sarah Miller, David said, pacing in front of the jury. He exploited their labor, violated their trust, and when someone dared to stand up to him, he used every tool at his disposal to silence them. But today, you have the power to hold him accountable, to send a message that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, is above the law. The jury's eyes followed him, their focus unwavering. For a moment, it felt like the tide had fully turned in Sarah's favor. But then Reese's lawyer took the floor. His tone was measured, his words deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we have here is a young woman with a tragic story, yes. But stories aren't facts. And the so-called evidence against my client is riddled with questions. Where did it come from? Why was it conveniently produced after years of silence? And why should we trust it?" He paused, letting the jury absorb his words. "My client is a respected businessman, a philanthropist who has given more to this community than most people can imagine. Don't let baseless accusations tear down a man who has built so much." Reese sat with his hands folded, his face a mask of calm confidence. But Sarah knew better. He was a master manipulator, and his lawyer's performance was just another act in his charade. That night, Sarah stayed at David's house again, her nerves fraying as the trial inched closer to a verdict. The police had patrolled her neighborhood, but the presence of Reese's men lingered in her mind. As she sat on the couch, scrolling through the latest news coverage of the case, her phone buzzed with a text from the unknown number. "Tomorrow is critical. Be ready for anything." She stared at the message, her heart racing. Who was this person? Were they warning her or taunting her? She showed the message to David, who frowned deeply. "Do you think it's Rachel?" Sarah asked. David shook his head. "It doesn't match her pattern. Whoever this is, they're watching closely, and that makes them dangerous." The next day in court, the defense called their final witness. Sarah's stomach dropped as Kevin, her former manager, took the stand. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room. "Mr. Wilson," Reese's lawyer began, "you were Sarah Miller's direct supervisor at Reese's Megamart. Is that correct?" "Yes," Kevin replied, his voice shaky. "And can you describe her behavior as an employee?" Kevin hesitated, glancing at Sarah before answering. She was outspoken, always asking questions about her hours and pay. The lawyer smiled faintly. "Outspoken. Would you say she was difficult to manage?" Kevin shifted in his seat. "I wouldn't say that, but she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself." "Interesting," the lawyer said, pacing slowly. "And did she ever make comments about filing a lawsuit or seeking legal action against the company?" Kevin hesitated again, sweat forming on his brow. She mentioned it once, when her hours were cut. The lawyer turned to the jury, his expression triumphant. "So, she was already considering legal action before any of these so-called injustices occurred?" David stood. "Objection, Your Honor." Leading the witness. "Sustained," the judge said firmly. "Mr. Henderson, stay on track." The lawyer nodded, backing off slightly, but the damage was done. Kevin's testimony, while vague, planted seeds of doubt about Sarah's motives. During the lunch break, Sarah and David huddled in his office, strategizing for the final hours of the trial. David's phone buzzed, and his face darkened as he read the message. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. David looked up, his expression grim. "The judge just received an anonymous package. It contains video footage that supposedly implicates you in a scheme to falsify evidence." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What? That's not possible." David stood, his fists clenched. "Reese is pulling out every trick in the book. But we're not going to let him win." Back in court, the package was presented to the judge. The footage showed Sarah speaking with Rachel at the Pinewood Cafe. The audio was unclear, but the defense argued that it depicted Sarah coercing Rachel into providing the flash drive. "This video," Reese's lawyer declared, "shows the plaintiff conspiring with a disgruntled ex-employee to fabricate evidence against my client." David countered immediately, arguing that the footage had been edited and lacked context. The judge allowed the trial to proceed, but warned both sides that tampering would not be tolerated. The day ended in chaos, the courtroom buzzing with tension. As Sarah left the building, flanked by David and police officers, she spotted Reese watching her from a distance. Their eyes met, and his lips curled into a cold, victorious smile. That night, Sarah sat in David's office, clutching the USB drive like a lifeline. "He's going to win, isn't he?" she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. David shook his head firmly. "Not if we keep fighting. He's throwing everything at us because he's scared, Sarah. He knows we have the truth, and that's why he's desperate." But as Sarah stared out the window into the dark night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Reese's next move would be the most devastating yet. The courtroom was packed the following morning, the air heavy with tension. The final stages of the trial were underway, and both sides were preparing to make their last moves. Sarah sat beside David, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. The memory of Reese's smirk from the day before lingered in her mind, filling her with equal parts fear and determination. As the judge entered and the courtroom fell silent, Reese's lawyer rose to address the court. "Your Honor, before we proceed with closing arguments, the defense would like to introduce one final piece of evidence." David immediately stood, his voice sharp. "Your Honor," The defense has repeatedly introduced last-minute evidence in an attempt to derail this trial. This is clearly a tactic to confuse the jury. The judge frowned. "Mr. Henderson, what is this evidence?" Reese's lawyer held up a thick folder. "Your Honor, this contains financial records that suggest Miss Miller's claims of financial hardship were exaggerated. These documents include recent deposits into her bank account, which raise questions about her credibility." David's jaw clenched, but he stayed calm. "Your Honor, this is another baseless accusation. We demand to see this evidence before it's presented to the jury." The judge nodded. "Mr. Henderson, provide the documents to the plaintiff's counsel for review." The folder was handed over, and David quickly flipped through its contents. His face darkened as he scanned the pages. "What is it?" Sarah whispered. "They're trying to frame you again," David said quietly. "These deposits, they're fabricated." David stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we believe these documents have been falsified. We request an immediate forensic analysis to determine their authenticity." The judge sighed, clearly frustrated with the escalating tactics. "I will allow the analysis. In the meantime, we'll proceed with closing arguments." David's closing argument was a masterclass in storytelling and evidence presentation. He recounted the timeline of Sarah's employment, the hardship she faced, and the courage it took for her to stand up to a man as powerful as Patrick Reese. "This case is not just about Sarah Miller," David said, his voice steady. "It's about every worker who has been silenced, exploited, and dismissed. Patrick Reese built his fortune by taking from those who could least afford to lose. But today, you have the power to make things right, to hold him accountable, to send a message that justice is not reserved for the wealthy." The jury's eyes were fixed on him, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Then Reese's lawyer stood, his tone measured and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me remind you of one thing: doubt. If there is any doubt about the plaintiff's claims, about the evidence, about her motives, then you cannot, in good conscience, find my client guilty." He turned to Sarah, his gaze piercing. "Miss Miller is young, ambitious, and, as we've seen, willing to go to great lengths to secure her future. But ambition and desperation can cloud judgment. Do not let sympathy overshadow the facts." As the trial concluded, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Sarah sat in silence, her hands trembling. The weight of the case, the lies, and the truth all bore down on her. "Whatever happens," David said quietly, "you've done everything you could." Sarah nodded, but her chest felt heavy. She couldn't shake the feeling that Reese still had something up his sleeve. That evening, as Sarah and David prepared for the verdict announcement the next day, Sarah's phone buzzed with a new message from the unknown number. This one was a video link, accompanied by the words, "If you want to win, show this tomorrow." David leaned over, his brows furrowing as he watched the video on Sarah's phone. The footage was clear and unedited. It showed Reese in a private meeting with two of his executives, openly discussing wage theft, falsifying records, and silencing dissenting employees. "This is it," David said, his voice filled with urgency. "This is the smoking gun." Sarah's eyes widened. "But how do we present it? The court might reject it as last-minute evidence." David smiled faintly. "Not if we frame it right. Let me handle this." The next morning, the courtroom was electric with anticipation as the jury filed in. Before the judge could ask for the verdict, David stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff requests permission to present one final piece of evidence that was just brought to our attention." Reese's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The jury has already deliberated." The judge raised her hand to silence him. "What is this evidence, Mr. Carter?" David stepped forward. "A video recording, Your Honor. It directly implicates Mr. Reese in wage theft and fraudulent activity. It is critical for the jury to see this before rendering their verdict." The judge paused, then nodded. "Show it." The courtroom fell silent as the video played. Reese's voice was unmistakable, his words damning. The jury watched intently, their expressions shifting from shock to outrage. When the video ended, Reese's lawyer stammered, trying to recover. "Your Honor, this video could have been manipulated." David cut him off. We'll submit it for forensic analysis if necessary. But the content speaks for itself. Mr. Reese has been caught red-handed. The judge turned to the jury. You've seen the evidence. If you feel it warrants further deliberation, you may reconvene. The jury didn't hesitate. The foreperson stood. Your Honor, we've already reached a verdict. Sarah's heart pounded as the verdict was read. In the case of Sarah Miller versus Patrick Reese, we find in favor of the plaintiff. Cheers erupted in the courtroom, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Reese sat frozen, his confident demeanor finally cracking. As the judge dismissed the court, Reese's lawyer leaned over to whisper something to him. But Reese shoved him away and stormed out, his face a mask of rage. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Sarah and David, shouting questions. David held up a hand. Today is a victory not just for Sarah, but for every worker who has been exploited. Justice has been served. But as Sarah smiled for the cameras, a chilling thought crossed her mind. Reese wouldn't take this lying down. The fight might be over in court, but in the real world, she knew he still had the power to strike back. The courthouse steps were a sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters, but Sarah's thoughts were far from celebratory. She smiled and nodded as David fielded questions, but in her heart, she knew this wasn't the end. Patrick Reese's cold, seething glare as he stormed out of the courtroom was etched in her memory. A man like him wouldn't accept defeat quietly. Later that evening, Sarah returned to her mother's house. Claire greeted her with a tight hug, tears in her eyes. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. You did it? Sarah hugged her back, but her mind was elsewhere. Mom, I need to talk to you about something. They sat at the kitchen table, the warmth of the small house a stark contrast to the chaos of the courtroom. Sarah hesitated, then pulled out her phone and played the recording from the USB drive, the one where Reese threatened Claire. Claire's face went pale as the familiar words filled the room. Her hands trembled, and she covered her mouth. When the recording ended, she whispered, I didn't know anyone recorded that. Sarah's voice was steady. I know why you did what you did, Mom. I know he backed you into a corner. But why didn't you tell me the truth? Why didn't you trust me? Tears streamed down Claire's face. Because I was scared, Sarah. Scared of what he'd do to you, to us. I thought if I stayed quiet, he'd leave us alone. Sarah reached across the table, gripping her mother's hands. He didn't leave us alone. He's been trying to destroy me this whole time. But it's over now. He's been exposed. Claire nodded, wiping her tears. I just want you to be safe, Sarah. Promise me you'll be careful. I will, Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure how she could promise that. Reese was still out there. The next few days were a whirlwind of interviews, media appearances, and congratulations. Social media exploded with support for Sarah, with hashtags like #JusticeForSarah and #ReeseExposed trending nationwide. Former employees of Reese's Megamart began coming forward with their own stories, adding fuel to the fire. But beneath the public outpouring of support, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. She noticed unfamiliar cars parked near her house, felt eyes on her when she walked down the street. When she mentioned it to David, he dismissed it as paranoia. He's lost, Sarah, David assured her. He doesn't have the power to hurt you anymore. But Sarah wasn't convinced. One evening, as Sarah was scrolling through her phone, she received another text from the unknown number. Be careful. He's planning something. Her chest tightened. She immediately forwarded the message to David, who called her within minutes. This is getting ridiculous, he said. We need to find out who's sending these messages. Sarah agreed. But what if they're trying to warn me? Or manipulate you? David countered. Either way, we can't ignore it. David reached out to his contacts in law enforcement, requesting a trace on the number. Meanwhile, Sarah began to piece together her own timeline of events, hoping to identify any patterns or connections. The break came 2 days later. David received a call from a detective working on the trace. The number belongs to someone named Rachel Turner, he said, former executive assistant to Patrick Reese. Sarah's heart sank. Rachel, the whistleblower who had risked everything to help her. Why was she still in contact? And why hadn't she revealed herself sooner? David and Sarah immediately tried to contact Rachel, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Concerned, They decided to visit her apartment. When they arrived, they found the door slightly ajar. "Rachel?" David called out, pushing the door open carefully. The apartment was a mess, papers scattered across the floor, furniture overturned. It was clear someone had been there. Sarah's stomach churned as she spotted a framed photo of Rachel shattered on the floor. "She's gone," David said grimly. And whoever was here wasn't just looking for her. They were looking for something. Sarah's mind raced. The USB drive. "Do you think she had more evidence?" David nodded. "It's possible. And if Reese's people took it, we're in trouble." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stared at her ceiling, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. At around 2 a.m., her phone buzzed again. Another message. "Meet me tomorrow at 7 p.m. by the abandoned warehouse on Oak Street. Come alone." Her heart skipped a beat. Was it Rachel? Or was it a trap? She forwarded the message to David, who replied immediately, "No way. It's too dangerous. Let's talk in the morning." But Sarah couldn't wait. If there was a chance Rachel was alive, she had to take it. The following evening, Sarah stood outside the darkened warehouse, her breath visible in the chilly air. The area was deserted, the streetlights flickering ominously. She clutched her phone tightly, ready to call for help if needed. "Sarah," a voice called softly from the shadows. She turned to see Rachel stepping out from behind a stack of crates. She looked disheveled, her clothes wrinkled and her face pale. "Rachel," Sarah said, relief flooding her. "Are you okay?" Rachel nodded. "I'm fine, but we don't have much time. Reese's men are everywhere. They're trying to tie up loose ends." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Rachel glanced around nervously. "There's more evidence, bigger than what you've seen. It's enough to destroy Reese completely. But it's not safe here. We need to go somewhere secure." Before Sarah could respond, headlights flooded the warehouse, and the sound of tires screeching filled the air. A black SUV barreled toward them, its occupants leaping out with guns drawn. "Run!" Rachel screamed, grabbing Sarah's arm. They darted toward the back of the warehouse, weaving through crates and machinery. The men shouted orders, their footsteps echoing behind them. Sarah's heart pounded as she ran, adrenaline surging through her veins. "This way!" Rachel shouted, leading Sarah to a side door. As they burst through it, they found themselves in a narrow alley. But before they could make it to the street, a figure stepped in front of them, blocking their path. "Patrick Reese." "End of the line," he said coldly, a cruel smile on his face. Patrick Reese stood in the dim light of the alley, his presence towering and menacing. Behind him, his men closed in, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she gripped Rachel's arm tightly. Reese's voice was icy. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Sarah. I gave you the chance to walk away, but you didn't take it. Now you'll regret it." Sarah's heart raced, but she forced herself to speak. "You can't intimidate me anymore, Reese. The truth is out. The jury saw it. Everyone saw it. You've already lost." Reese smirked, his cold eyes narrowing. "Lost? Do you think a courtroom verdict changes anything? I built this empire, and no court, no teenager is going to tear it down." Rachel stepped forward, her voice trembling but defiant. "You're done, Patrick. I have everything, records, recordings, emails. It's over." Reese's expression darkened. "You think you're safe because you have dirt on me? You're just another loose end." He gestured to his men, who began advancing. Sarah's mind raced as she searched for a way out. Then she remembered her phone in her pocket. She fumbled with it, hitting the emergency call button as discreetly as possible. Reese didn't notice. His focus was on Rachel. "You always thought you were smarter than everyone else, Rachel. But you're not. You're just like all the others, useful, then disposable. You'll never get away with this," Sarah said, her voice louder now, buying time. "The police know everything. They're coming for you." Reese laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "You're bluffing." But in the distance, faint sirens began to wail. Reese's smirk faltered, and he turned to his men. "We're leaving. Now." Rachel stepped forward. "No, Patrick. You're not going anywhere." She pulled a small recorder from her pocket and pressed play. Reese's voice filled the alley. A recording of him explicitly admitting to bribery, wage theft, and threatening employees. The damning evidence echoed through the night. Reese's face twisted in fury. "You'll regret that." But before he could act, the alley flooded with red and blue lights. Police cars screeched to a stop, officers pouring out with weapons drawn. Reese's men froze, realizing they were outnumbered. "Patrick Reese," an officer shouted, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and multiple other charges. Put your hands in the air." Reese hesitated, his fists clenching, but with the police surrounding him, he had no choice. He raised his hands, his face a mask of rage as the officers cuffed him and led him to a car. His men followed, subdued one by one. Sarah and Rachel stood frozen, watching as Reese's empire crumbled before their eyes. An officer approached them. "Are you both okay?" Sarah nodded, her voice shaky. "Yes, thank you." Rachel handed over the recorder. "This should help seal his fate." The officer took it, nodding. "You both did the right thing. He won't be able to wiggle out of this one." The next day, news of Reese's arrest dominated every headline. Videos of him being led away in handcuffs played on every channel. Former employees cheered, social media erupted in celebration, and justice finally felt real. Rachel disappeared from the spotlight, seeking a quiet life away from the chaos. Before she left, she hugged Sarah tightly. "You're braver than I ever was. Don't ever forget that." Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes. "You saved me, Rachel." "Thank you." As for Sarah, her life changed forever. She used the settlement money to help her mother and to pursue her college dreams. The scars Reese left behind wouldn't fade quickly, but she found strength in the knowledge that she had stood up to a giant and won. Months later, as she walked across her college campus, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an article about Reese's sentencing, 25 years in prison. Sarah smiled faintly, knowing she had played a part in bringing him to justice. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. For herself, for her mother, and for everyone Reese had wronged. Justice had prevailed, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt free.